And thank you for having me out here. The St. Sharbel Spiritual Center was a stroke of brilliance or a stroke of listening to the Holy Spirit, because this is precisely what the Catholic Church needs in the West, in America. It needs to return to mystical prayer, contemplative prayer, meditative prayer. If we don't return to what St. Sharbel knew so well, then we don't really have a heartbeat's chance to really make it out of this moral mess that we're in society. St. Sharbel knew the trick. I'm going to go disappear. And that's why I mean this genuinely. So maybe I shuck and jive, maybe I'm an Irishman, but I mean this genuinely. I can't think of a better place I'd rather speak than here about what I'm going to speak about today. I'm going to speak about somebody who had a devotion to St. Sharbel, who, as we speak this very instant, is living in a cell in a forest where he's turned over the remainder of his life as a Holocaust, as an expiation. He is a consecrated hermit. It's Father Martin Flume. I'm here today to tell a story that is raw, that is untamed, that is ugly, and that at the end is transcendent and the work of God in my life and my wife Krista's life. I'm just going to get into it. I've written 5 books. This was the hardest thing I've ever done. I don't say that like a drama queen. I say that like genuinely, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. But in 2021, Krista came up to me and said the most remarkable thing. She said, Father Flume had just departed after 20 years of being an archdiocesan priest in Washington, D.C., and asked his bishop, Cardinal Gregory, if he could turn over the rest of his life as a hermit. Cardinal Gregory said, sure, that's your thing, if that's what you want. And so that's where Father Flume has been for 3 years. He's been living the life of St. Sharbel. And if you knew Father Flume, you would know if anyone's going to do it, it's going to be Father Flume. I think as I get into the story a bit, you might see why. But Krista said, hey Kevin, I want you to expose my dark years, our dark years, so that the priesthood of Father Flume can be exposed. I want you to write the story of how Father Flume showed no fear during COVID. Write to people of how he saved me during the pandemic, maybe my soul. Show them the muscularity of how a priest behaves during a pandemic. Show them what a man does. Of course, my answer was no. Writing the story of our lives from 2012 to 2019 would have meant I would put Krista's stuff on the street, our stuff on the street. A husband doesn't do that to his wife, who he loves. I had brain surgery in 2009, and in the aftermath, Krista began to secretly binge drink red wine. Krista said, write the book about what Father Flume did. I'm not going to stop, Kevin. My old skin, my old Adam, my old Eve, that's gone. I'm a new creation for what Father Flume was able to do for me. Father Flume took a spiral staircase down into Krista's woundedness, into her shame during that year. And he stayed there throughout COVID-19, and he didn't come back up from that staircase until he came up with the wounds, the baggage, the shame, and all the stuff, until it was fully scalpeled out. Kevin, write the story. I want you to show the world Father Flume. So I began to write about this St. Sharbel type of priest. As I mentioned, it was the hardest piece of writing I've ever done. I've written thousands of articles, I've written books. But each morning I woke up at 4 a.m. and I felt like I was stepping down into Molokai or Golgotha and pulling up gruesome things, bad memories that I chose to forget. But I knew if I stuck it out and kept writing and plugging away and bleeding all over the laptop, And at the end, it was a story of the honeymoon that Krista and I were on, so I kept with it and finally got the book done. And I thought the book I had written was the one that Krista had asked me to write. And by the way, this is the first time I'm telling this story in front of Krista, my wife, so it's a bit indelicate, but she said, "Pull the trigger, Kevin, let it go. Let it fly." She was the one that asked me to write the book. But only priests like St. Sharbel and Father Flume and those that understand the burden of their identity to wake up each day fighting for souls can do what they're able to do with Krista and for my family, to promote these recoveries and miracles of healing by crucifying themselves to the identity of the priesthood. In Father Flume's case, even in seminary, from the earliest days in seminary, he began to fast, abstain from meats, alcohol, and all unnecessary comforts. Why would he do this in seminary? Why? Because he wanted to conform his body and his soul to Christ, the starved man of the cross. This seminarian Flume, this crazy man, wanted to make the centerpiece of his priesthood in identification with the crucified Christ from the very beginning. You know, one example, they didn't offer adoration at his seminary, so nightly he would hop in his little Toyota and drive across the streets of D.C. to a Maryland suburban parish where he could adore the Blessed Sacrament. He gave his priesthood to Mary. Mary, it's all yours. Mary, you will have all of me. So when he was ordained 25 or so years ago, he was set for the times because that's when Theodore McCarrick stepped into his diocese as the cardinal. We're not going to get into that now because we're here to talk about Father Flume and Krista. I first met Father Flume in 2016 on a silent retreat where I poured out to him in confession my growing despair, my sin of despair, with Krista's pain and with her habits. And he spoke beautiful words to me that are captured in this book. After confession, I waited for him. It was about 10 at night, and I said, "Father, will you come out to my house?" And I knew that Krista at this time, Krista was still in a tough spot here. This is when the habit was still running pretty hard of the secret binge drinking. So, will you come out to my house for dinner? And I knew Krista would hate that. She would see it as a 2-against-1 sabotage against her drinking. But we know the deal. It's always better to apologize and ask permission. So Father Flume says, "Sure, I'd love to come out for dinner, Kevin, sure." So we wrote down a date. And then a few months later, on a very cold winter night, he knocked at our door for dinner. I was 1,000 miles away on a trip. I'd forgotten to write down the date. If I could read just a little bit about that night, Krista. The moon was rising above our frozen field when Krista opened our front door no wider than the width of a Webster's dictionary. Cold winter air pushed into our stone-flagged foyer. It was dinner time on February 8th, 2016, when my 13-year-old son, Sean, told his mom that a man had been knocking on our door. She had heard the knocking, but she ignored it. Behind the locked door of our bedroom, Krista had been drinking. She put the wine bottle away, tucking it inside her black leather equestrian boot in the corner of our closet. Then, walking through the hallway to the front door, she set herself to dismiss quickly the Seventh-day Adventist, the salesman, the neighbor, or whoever it was that was the nuisance at this moment. I often picture that night that Father Flume looked into Krista's eyes for the first time. Once, he shared with me that sorrow wrung his heart that night. This is how Krista remembers this night. The porch was unlit. Beneath the moon glow was the silhouette of a slender man with a stunning beard. It was as broad and messy as Karl Marx, an imperial nest of white and gray of biblical bearing that spread to the top button of his black wool jacket. The night was graveyard silent. The stranger was of average height and had graying hair shaved close to his head. He stood in the stillness, looking directly at Krista through the 3-inch door crack. He kept his hands buried in his coat pockets. Quote, "He looks like a roadside hitchhiker," was my wife's first mental image in consideration of the man. She squinted into the lengthening shadows and studied his manner more deeply. She saw that beneath his coat was a black cassock with a thin vertical alignment of a few dozen small buttons stretching from his collar down to the top of his shoes. She recognized that it was a Catholic priest who was standing before her. He resembled an over-embellished character from an earlier period, like the long-nosed, tight ponytailed Ichabod Crane. Then, suddenly, fear ran through her body like poison. He knows me, and he knows what I'm doing. Unbeknownst to her, Father Flume had spent the day fasting for this visit. Getting hold of her emotions, Krista stared into the priest's dark brown eyes and recognized an intelligence and a depth. Behind his unfashionable glasses were kind, warm eyes. She saw that swallowed up within his venerable beard was what seemed to be the smile of a humble man from the countryside. She perceived in his essence a well of benevolence. A man of strength and peace stood before her in the moon's shadows. Perhaps due to her secret shame and her seeming authority, she flinched, broke eye contact, and lowered her eyes upon his Old Testament beard. When Father Flume saw the disharmony lodged in Krista's ringed eyes, a movement of sorrow pierced him. Standing before him was what seemed like a self-destructing soul. He noted her inability to maintain eye contact. He saw, too, that she seemed to be antagonized by his presence, or at least had an outward frustration for the net in which she knew she had found herself caught. It was true. Krista told me later that she was furious that Sean had answered the door, and even more enraged that it was a priest who stood before her as the visitor. "Hello there," Father Flume said softly, reassuringly. "I'm Father Flume, and I guess I'm here for dinner." Gentle puffs of wintertime vapor airlifted from his beard. He stood beneath a bare branch of the red maple that extended over a small porch. The crack of the door remained a slit. Although the light switch was within reach, the porch stayed dark. Rather than sweetly faking a welcome smile of cordiality, Krista became immediately cold-hearted. Her eyes became slits. "Kevin's not here. He didn't tell me anything about a dinner tonight." "I didn't know anything about you coming here. Who are you?" "I'm sorry your husband didn't let you know. My name is Father Flume. I'm not sure what happened." "You must be Krista. I'm a friend of Kevin's. We got to know one another at a retreat in Faulkner," he said. "He didn't tell me anything about you." "And he didn't tell me anything about a dinner." "Oh, well, I'm sorry. Kevin must have gotten things mixed up. He arranged a dinner tonight at your home. Drove quite a way, and I'm hungry," he said cheerfully from the shadows, not betraying his discomfort at the unwelcoming. "Would you mind if I stepped in? It's cold out here." Krista inventoried his words, and from her interior came a single thought. This night is meant for sabotage. This is a siege. It was then that a rebellion, a dark vein of defiance, sprang from within her. Fury lay heavy in her eyes. Abruptly, she worked to gain hold of what she was certain was a plan to address her drinking. Her eyes became cold orbs as she stiffened herself to get rid of him. She no longer looked into his beard. She looked directly into his eyes. "I know nothing about this, and I have no idea who you are," she said icily, intensely staring at him. "Why don't you call my husband and ask him why he's not here? He's 1,000 miles away now. Great planner he is." Father Flume was disarmed by her sarcasm. He fell into a bemused look the awkward and pure smile of a kindergartner at his first picture taking. Well, this is a bit indelicate. How's this? Krista, I'm not a picky eater. Whatever you got, I'll eat. How's that? I'm a hungry priest who just haven't had much of anything today. But the oven was cold and the kitchen was dark. No. Again, I know nothing about you or this. Her voice rising. An icy stillness held as she were protecting herself against something leprous. Well, maybe we can sort things out inside, he said quietly. You've been impositioned, and I apologize. I don't want to put you out for a meal, but maybe we could just talk for a bit. No, she said with a glacial gaze. The priest stood wordless. The inner turbulence he saw was enormous, and pity covered him. There's a Wawa on the corner up the road, Krista said, filling the silence with a tide of anger. Then she finished him up, remarking as she closed the door, "Get something to eat over there." From the long vertical windows on each side of the door, Krista saw that Father Flume stood motionless for a while on the porch. After some time, he turned and walked back to his truck with the faded Maryland bumper sticker. The truck remained engine turned off for 10 or so minutes. For a while, Krista spied on him from a window in our living room, looking at the silhouette of his truck. She didn't know that he was likely commanding prayers of deliverance. Figuring he was making a phone call, she grew bored and went back into her bedroom, closed and locked the door, where she rummaged through the closet and recovered the bottle inside her boot. These 7 years later, Krista believes that as she was getting drunk, that Father Flume was scattering blessed salt and water where the frozen ground ran up against the brick veneer at the edge of our home. With her inner eye in retrospect, she sees the vapor trail from his breath that night carried prayers of deliverance for an afflicted soul, unscented incense released into the soft winter night, carried on a swirling breeze past constellations to the thrones of God. The invocations most surely mark the first of what will become Father Flume's numberless prayers to wrest the stronghold of alcohol and woundedness from Krista's grip. In Krista's imagination, she still sees Father Flume untangling his cassock from the dead shrubbery in the undergrowth as he proceeds down the border of her home like a nocturnal termite inspector. She believes now it was that winter evening when the big bearded priest began to pull her soul from hell. How was that, Chris? I want to tell you something wild about this book. This book that I didn't want to write, and Krista, the strongest, most vulnerable, boldest person I know, urged me to write after many months. You know, I'm not a supernaturalist. Like, I grew up in a family, Mrs. Bushko would tell you, that was like, Dad and Mom were like, hey, your faith is your faith. You don't need miracles. You don't need them, Kevin. Now, I know St. Sharbel is accredited with more miracles, and that's wonderful. Like, I love miracles as much as the next guy. But Dad and Mom were like, no, we're going to pray the rosary. And I just want to say this. All of my family are still faithful Catholics today. Praise be God. But Mom and Dad were like, we go to Mass. We know what Lent is. We know what prayers are. We're going to teach you. But we don't need miracles. We don't need it. So I grew up, I wasn't a supernaturalist. But I didn't write this book. I don't say this like a drama queen, like a supernaturalist. What do I mean? So, the book carries my name. I typed out the words and all that. But I believe this book was written by the Holy Spirit. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when I finally got around to writing the book, that Krista said, hey, you can write this thing. A mysterious thing happened. A funny thing happened. So I finally finished the manuscript. And I gave it to 4 people that I really respect. I gave it to a theologian, 2 Catholic authors, and another writer. And I told them, I said, hey, this book was rough. This was a roller coaster ride. This is a weird one. But I tried to write a book about what Father Flume did for my wife and others during COVID, what the holiness, what the muscularity, what the strength of a priest looked like during that time. I just want to show what a priest looks like during tough times. I'm like, Kevin, it sounds like a pretty good book. Let me read it. So the 4 of them read it. And then one by one, they all got back. And the first one said this, hey, Kevin, I know what you thought you wrote about Father Flume, and yeah, you got that in there, but you didn't write that book. You wrote a book about marriage. And of course, I'm like, that clown's got it all wrong. You know, he's a theologian, but I don't care what he's got it all wrong. And then the next 3 people, you wrote a book about marriage. Then the book came out last month, and people started to contact, thank you for helping me with my marriage. I believe the Holy Spirit wrote the Hermit as he wanted it written. And that's why it's my favorite book, because I didn't write it. I believe that the Holy Spirit did. So I speak to you today at the St. Sharbel Center because Krista, the bravest person I know, has asked me to. She wanted to expose her dark years so Father Flume could be exposed, and I guess marriage is exposed. Because I'm an old sports writer, because I'm Irish, I think what I'll do is, Father mentioned in his homily, I was thinking, how do I talk to the folks at St. Sharbel Center? They're a little deeper mix of Catholics, they get it. So I'm going to sort of address this talk in the last 4 things. We're in November. But I want to address the last 4 things and address it as sort of how the supernatural reality of these things, and that can actually come on to the inside, not the outside, but the inside where we are now on earth, where our souls, or at least mine and Krista's, are brought face to face with Jesus and the devil. So I'll speak a little bit about death and judgment before I spend time on hell, and thank God heaven. I'll start with death. I just turned 40, and for years my family had been going on this retreat since the 1950s out in southern Maryland called Loyola Retreat House. You're hard-pressed to find a prettier place on the eastern seaboard of America. It sits way up on a cliffside and overlooks a wide expanse of the Potomac River. And I guess because I just turned 40, no matter where I went, it sits on about 250 acres. Forest, open area, you see bald eagles. I mean, it's a beautiful spot. The Potomac, it's just, sunsets there cause men to cry. I mean, it's just beautiful. But everywhere I went, for the first time in 15, 20 years, was this poking awareness, you're not getting it done. You're growing up. You're 40 years old now, and some of these habits, sloth, pride, you're not loving well enough, there's more in your tank, they're becoming actually part of your identity, part of who you are. And you're no longer 30, you're 40, and you have 3 kids, and you have a wife who needs you, and it was this. So I don't care where I was. I could have been in adoration, I could have been at benediction, I could have been at hearing and listening to a talk, or walking around looking at the eagles or the sunset, but it was this, I couldn't shake it. The jig was up because it was the voice of, what did John Newman call it? The primordial vicar of Christ. It was my conscience. So I had this tradition where on the last night of retreat, I always go way down this hillside to the dock. And on this particular night, it was very cold. And because it's in the countryside, you can see the Milky Way, you see all the stars. And there was, I guess it was a full moon that night because it was very bright walking down the hill. And it seemed to me that the full moon was sort of God's swinging lantern. Like it was sitting on a stool looking down on me, sort of stroking his beard and shaking his head and saying, yeah, you were here last year, and the year before, and the year before, and the year before that, and you had all these grand intentions from retreat, from a good talk, or maybe you did a holy hour at 3 in the morning, or maybe all these things came to you. and you set these resolutions on this dock. And then you went home. And maybe after the second or third nuisance, it all just cracked and faded and you became who you were again. Maybe you got lucky sometimes and you made it to the fifth or sixth or seventh nuisance. But it would all just kind of go back to who you were. So we know what this retreat is, Kevin. It's a weekend incubator for you to feel holy. That's useless to me. So what do you got this year? And the jig was up. And it had to have been of the Holy Spirit because I had never considered this thought in my life. And it was this on the dock. And I remember the waves, it was a windy night. The waves were sort of slapping up against the dock. And I was standing out there and God was on the stool with the lantern looking down. And I said, God, you sent your son into the world to endure violence, to redeem all of humanity. God, maybe that's what I need. Maybe for me to be redeemed, to become the man that you will me to become. Maybe that's what I need is violence. Maybe I need to be struck down. God, will you flatten me, God? I think I need to be flattened. So God, make it violent. Send me down. Never had a thought like that in my life, and I knelt down on the dock and I had this warm feeling going through me. And I knew that the other shoe was going to drop because Mom and Dad raised me and my siblings to understand that God answered these prayers 100% of the time. And I didn't know when it was going to come, but I knew I was going to be inflicted with God's violence because he knew I wanted to be holy. And this was my inspiration. A month later, almost to the exact ticking second, it was like somebody took a tomahawk and flung it against the back of my head. I had a brain aneurysm. Ooh. I was rushed to the hospital. Thank God Krista was next to me, and nothing was working. The blood was drowning my brain. They couldn't go into where the malformation was because it was pretty deep in there. But they kept putting him in these MRI tubes to kind of chart the blood so they can stick a tube up there to embolize it or glue it, to do the best they could. And there were shunts. They were sticking these shunts in my head to take the blood out. And it was the third time I was in one of these tubes, and they had given me a contrast to get a better look into the brain, to see it more clearly of maybe how they could really get to that bleed, that tangle of blood vessels. And when they gave me the contrast, I had a reaction. And I began to vomit in that tube. And at this point, I was already a mess. I mean, I couldn't speak. I was a rag doll. I couldn't do anything. So I couldn't tell the nurses that I was choking on my vomit because I couldn't talk anyway. And all of a sudden, the thought of this and dying from this was, I'm going to choke to death. And when I was in there, I wasn't thinking about the whoppers of sins in my past. As I was thinking, maybe I got another 30 seconds, or maybe another minute, or I don't know, maybe I'll somehow make it through this thing. But I was thinking about this. I was too comfortable. I was too comfortable as a Catholic man. I had way more in the tank. I could have loved better. I could have loved more. What a rotten thing on your judgment day to sit across to say, I didn't love well enough, Jesus. There was more in me. I swallowed down the vomit because I wasn't eating anyway, and I survived the night. Then a day or two later, I was given major invasive brain surgery because they couldn't get to the blood. And that failed too. A call was made to my uncle, Monsignor Thomas Wells' best friend, Father James Stack. My uncle, Monsignor Wells, was murdered in his rectory in the year 2000. He was some priests will tell you in D.C. to this day, he was one of the greatest priests in the history of the Archdiocese of Washington, for reasons I won't get into, for reasons that are in the book over there, The Priest We Need to Save the Church. But Father Jim Stack was his best friend, and Father Stack had just started a healing ministry. Hey, Kevin's dying, you got to get up here. So he drove about an hour from Hyattsville, Maryland to the University of Maryland Medical Center on the 7th floor, the Neuro ICU Center, where people go to die. That's the floor where people die. Krista never left the hospital, not even for an hour for those weeks. Krista saw people get wheeled out all the time on my floor. That's where people die. No one talks on that floor because they can't speak. They have severe brain injuries, and I was one of those guys. So when Father Stack stepped into my room, I was incapacitated because I just had surgery. And if he was here right now behind this lectern or standing right here, he would tell you, I don't want to get into it too much right now. It's actually described in this book because we're here to talk about Father Flume. But I could speak for half an hour about what Father Stack and his assistant had told me what happened in that ICU room. But when he knelt at my bedside and said, "Hey, Kevin, we've been calling on the Baltimore Saints, or the American Saints, and Mother Mary Lang and Elizabeth Ann Seton, and praying the Divine Chaplet. Is there any saints that we can have pray for you now? Saints intercede now." And he said, I whispered, and I was incapacitated. He said, I whispered, "Bring my uncle down, bring Tommy down." My uncle, Monsignor Thomas Wells. I grew up in his shadow, Tommy, Uncle Tommy. And he stands up like a V8 moment. Of course. And he stood at my bedside and started calling his best friend, one of my best friends, my uncle, Monsignor Wells, who had been dead for 9 years, and said, "Hey, bud, save him. Your nephew just asked you to save his life. Do it. If you don't do it, he's dead." The author always leaves you hanging on. I'm not going to tell you what happened thereafter. But the next day, everything was gone. Blood, fluids, arteriovenous malformation, all gone. Get out of the hospital. You're good. Go home. We don't know what happened, but you're good. So we talked about death, almost. Judgment. Lord, I didn't love well enough. And I thought, stupid me, dumb me, I thought that the love story began when I made it home. Like, God kept his end of the bargain, flatten me, make it violent. Okay, you want it. Bam, you're gone. No. It was to prepare me for what was to come. So when I got home from the hospital, I mean, it's bad when you have brain surgery. I had to relearn how to walk, to talk, all that kind of stuff. It was terrible. I couldn't write, couldn't see. So finally I got back to work, and man, did I want to get to know God better. So more daily masses, daily rosaries, joined a prison ministry, wanted to love Krista and the kids better, wanted to do God's will. Boy, it's time. It's go time, right, God? Thank you. Love story begins. Krista didn't like what she was seeing because it was sort of a new husband in a certain way, and it opened up a mother wound from her childhood. She didn't know she had it. I didn't know she had it, but it was the mother wound of shame. And Krista thought to herself, she explained this to me years later, that I can't go where he's going. I feel uncomfortable. I'm not worthy. I'm no good. And she began to secretly binge drink. I had it wrong. I thought the tomahawk in my head was meant just to be a better version of Kevin. I had it completely wrong. He flattened me for the years to follow because hell hadn't moved into my life yet. The type of hell that makes brain aneurysms and shunts jammed to your head and failed surgeries, flea bites. God would answer my dockside prayer and show me the furnace of his love only when I died to everything I knew. When I couldn't stop Krista from drinking. I know some folks probably came in today with some crosses, maybe some of you folks have some withering pains, some things going on right now. Maybe the reason you're here today is from what I'm going to say now, the rest of the talk, how hope, pinholes of hope comes into hell. The great thing about hell on this side is you can actually get out. You can actually get out. Even when it doesn't seem like it for years, you can get out. And boy, when you get out, does the honeymoon begin. So maybe some of what I share, hopefully what I share will sort of reach into the tomb or the casket of your pain. Like sort of an array of light or a ray of hope into your pain. I remember the first night, my marriage seemed to sort of blink out. The third wine bottle had shown up in a strange place in some cabinet we never used, and I remember I set it on a table on the kitchen island, and I knew it wasn't my kids. My kids are small, and I'm like, what's Krista doing? I don't understand what's going on. And I put it on the island, and Krista saw it. I said, Krista. And she fell quiet, and I did too, and we 1 or 2 minutes of just silence. And I remember thinking then, boy, this would be great, because maybe she'll expose some kind of old wound or something she's dealing with, and I can sort of hold her and embrace her and say, Krista, we're going to get through this thing together. And we both would sort of cry the same tears of pain and looking into her teary eyes and say, hey man, let's do this thing. Let's overcome this. But when she finally spoke, she looked at me in the eyes and said, Kevin, it's not a big deal. You always make a big deal of everything. And I was caught flat-footed because, what's this? So, Krista, a hidden wine bottle is not a big deal? Don't attack me. Don't you dare attack me. It's like you're always searching for reasons to go after me. Krista, I'm not attacking you. I'm just asking about the hidden bottles. Oh, so now you're spying on me. Holy Kevin likes to spy on his wife. God's probably really proud of you. Thanks for your concern. It's a great way of showing love for me. The back and forth continued in a way that it never had before, a single moment in our marriage. And as our voices rose and the walls seemed to sweat and push inward, I remember wondering if Gabby and Sean upstairs had their ears cupped to the bedroom doors saying, what's going on with Mom and Dad? And I'll never forget that first fight when sheets of lightning seemed to rip open from the sky and wickedness filled the room. Our words struck me as spiritually cursed, as if a demon ventriloquist commandeered, tainted, and steered each word out of our mouth. And that night marked the first night that reason and the loving language matrimonial bond of a husband and wife began to slowly leak from our home. I witnessed a side of Krista I had never seen. She seemed guided by a force that had removed her gentle nature and even taken hold of her essence and being. This was the evening that everything changed in our home and in our marriage. And the fight also became a template for each of the fights that followed when another hidden bottle turned up. I didn't know then, and Krista didn't either, of the Olympian magnitude of her decades-old unhealed mother wound of shame, and that her drinking was the manner Satan had encouraged her to kill it. I'm certainly not obsessed with the supernatural or the unseen or the inexplicable that we can't understand, but I will tell you that Satan is very real in the realm of alcohol. And that he works masterfully when he knows that there is a quiet, humble, and meek woman with a mother wound. Like, I got this one. I got her at the age of 7 or 8. It's been laying dormant, and now I got her for good. Alcoholism is an oppression owned by Satan. I don't know about pornography and drugs, I don't care. But alcohol, Satan's all over it. I was seeing a side to Krista I'd never seen. The change was startling. The sweetest, meekest, and humblest girl I ever knew seemed to have become a different entity. Just a little more time on what hell feels like. I promise I'm going to get to the good part. I could speak about this hell for a very long time, but it would defeat the purpose of where I'm going to go here and how God pulls us from hell. Even when he enters the worst type of addiction, violence, loneliness, and wounds, and then turns it all around. The evil one wanted Krista's soul. He wanted my marriage. He wanted my family. He wanted to burn it all down. But our metaphorical hell wasn't good enough for him. He wanted my entire family in his kingdom one day. He wanted us damned to hell. And as the years went by, it was always in the air. The wine, the weight of my powerlessness, Krista's ringed eyes, the growing chasm between us, the silence, the flickering out of the easy joy and the laughter from earlier days. A pressing down sensation followed me, and I imagine it followed Krista too, from room to room. I didn't feel at ease anywhere, at work, among friends, mass, prayer, even among my children. I imagine we shared equally in the sensation of entering a swallowing solitude that was hollowing us out in differing ways. But the feeling of desolation had become imperialistic for both of us. Simply, we were exhausted. And most mornings I knelt in the darkness at the bedside and looked at Krista asleep beneath the thick covers, and propelled by my deep love for her and desire to protect her, I quietly renounced the demons of wine and shame and blessed her with holy water. And then I asked God to reveal his will within the slow motion ruination of my marriage. And I begged for the wisdom of understanding the true path would finally set her free. So before getting ready for work, I pray where a handful of existential questions always emerged to me. How do I help love and serve my wife in this enslavement? What is my duty, God? What is my will? What is your will as her husband? What is your will for me? How do I die for her to help promote healing when she has repeatedly rejected it, all forms of it? Answers never came. In fact, all that really ever came with that time was the thought to continue practicing the customary Catholic heirlooms of rosaries, prayer, fasting, begging Jesus in the front of the monstrance, practice of charity in the home. Other than that, it became evident I had no idea what God's plan was for me. Krista had rejected AA, all forms of counseling. A heavy tarpaulin, it seemed to me, was beginning to separate me from the world. I began to see wine as a savage destroyer of both Krista and me, a poisonous and fast-moving cloud that was burning out the lungs of our souls. I found myself becoming mortally afraid then because I didn't know how to stop it or to stop her from buying or drinking it. For years she had hopscotched around, moving from liquor store to disguise her addiction. Besides prayers and dependence on God, I didn't know how to fight Satan for my wife. I remember praying with greater urgency then, but as the old pattern solidified, my prayers and my pleas began to feel despairing and disorderly, like a distressed man lost at sea who fires a flare that zigzags chaotically back into the ocean. A brief blaze of light that nobody sees. Our marriage grew quieter. I wouldn't ask Krista to leave the home, and she knew I would never leave. And as the days stretched on, Krista's isolation and binge drinking had taken on a frightening permanence. At times, I was my own worst enemy in this fight. Following maybe a bad night of drinking, I often arrived home carrying an arctic silence, even though I knew Krista subconsciously screamed for me to walk through the door as a merciful and understanding husband. Although I prayed at various times throughout the day for wisdom and forbearance, I sometimes behaved at home as seemingly having prayed for the exact opposite. I was living out the insidiousness of Paul's admission to the Romans in real time. So then it is no longer I that do it, but sin which dwells within me. I will what is right, but I cannot do it. I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want. And there was promising stretches when Krista emerged like Lazarus, bright-eyed from the tomb. But instead of lavishing her with affirmation in the hope that burned in me, I often tacked toward reservedness. Even as Krista's eyes showed with a glint of promise, mine, I imagine, looked guarded. There were days when she looked into my eyes for a safe port. She didn't find one. Looking back, I see that I wasn't Thomas, who doubted. I was Judas, who betrayed. My tiredness with the patterns and detachment made me an unwitting collaborationist to festering the pus in her wounds. Even though I knew it was up to Krista to quit her habits, I began to see how I was contributing to keeping the rock at the entrance of her tomb. It was with this awareness that I began to explore the dark corners in me that perhaps I had conveniently neglected when Krista began to secretly drink. I began to contemplate my soul before God, where awareness and humiliation covered me like an acid bath. He became alarmingly alive. And suddenly, before the furnace of his gaze, there was no barriers, there was no hiding places. I became aware of the clusters of graceless gestures, lazy omissions, and resentments. But the garment really began to tear and come apart when I pulled the strings of fidelity and sacrificial love. I knew Krista would never fully heal until I chose to love her without cost. So as a former journalist trained to investigate, I cautiously stepped into the unvisited places in me and began to force myself to lift and look beneath untouched rocks. Thereafter, in those places, I opened up inquisitional deluges, hoping that probing questions would clear pathways to loving my suffering wife as God wanted me to. The turbulence in our marriage had marred my intimacy with God in prayer. I had to relearn the manner of falling under God's gaze in the prayer that I knew how to do as a child. Although I had prayed ever since a little kid when Mom and Dad taught me, strangely, I'd forgotten how to pray. The awareness was alarming because I knew in my dryness, in my feelings of exhaustion, they were expanding like rumbling black clouds that push across the sky. In my prayerlessness, I knew the evil one would become even more unsparing with his work. I knew the demon would work at a fever pitch to lead me to emotionally dark places and begin the process of systematic disintegration of all hope. Bearing all this in mind moved me to devote myself to begin the untamed operations of meditative prayer, to deepen my relationship with God, whom I needed like I had never had before. So at night, I'd prop up my pillows and I'd turn the pages of St. Teresa of Avila's masterpiece on mystical prayer, The Interior Castle, which I had never read. The book to me became like a ribbon of peace in my soul. It was a lantern that lit my path to the interior life. And in the silence of my prayer, I began to understand that I needed to love Krista through the hard wood of the cross. Just as Jesus loved and poured himself out with no consolations from the cross, I would need to love Krista in the same exact fashion. I needed to be unburdened of any of my habitual emotional hang-ups and surrender Krista. Surrender the future of our marriage, my family, everything completely to God and trust. Very quickly, I was drawn to Teresa's pilgrimage. I imagine those 7 delineated chambers in this medieval castle that she writes about. Like these 7 chambers were the forward movement to divine union with God. And as I read The Interior Castle, I imagine myself standing sort of before that huge castle on the grass, before the moat, looking at this sort of this Gothic, cosmic, stone-faced castle, this medieval castle. Because my isolation and my pain and my soul were so profound, I mentally found myself wanting to race across the drawbridge into the safety, into the warmth of the castle, because I knew there was healing in there. But as I read on, I repeatedly saw myself falling off the bridge, off the moat, into the moat, where the serpents and the monsters began to snap and maul me to death. You see, Teresa placed stiff demands on advancement even into the castle, even to gain entrance. So I felt viscerally demoralized. I had a long way to go. Full betrothal and spiritual marriage to God required spiritual advancement through the mansions. And I had grudges. I had frustrations. I had movements of pride. I can't get into that castle. I finished the book uncomfortably awestruck. The chasm between me and crossing that drawbridge was enormous. It was galaxies away. I used to picture Teresa standing at that entrance of the castle, past the drawbridge, kind of looking at me. I'm out here on the grass saying, "You coming? Kevin, are you coming?" Satan was after me. I didn't know how to do it. He kept pulling from this cabinet of wiles, tricks. I would overcome one problem, he'd get me with another. I'd understand this one emotion, he'd get me with another. It was transmogrifying, it was always shifting his patterns. Then I began to finally battle him with one weapon more than any other. I tried to set my face like flint and just kept working to surrender everything to God. Krista needed me to love her as a man must love his wife despite the circumstances. And Satan, I knew, would work inexhaustibly to turn my thoughts inward, where I'd allow loneliness and lost marital entitlements and escalating hopelessness to prompt me to effeminately consider divorce. The evil one again wanted the annihilation of my family. I almost thought at that time he wanted to destroy me more than Krista, because he knew if I gave up, we were all dead. The answer to winning the war against Satan and gaining entrance to Teresa's castle was nailing my unknowingness of Krista's recovery to the cross and say, "God, I trust you. I give you all. I just ask you to help me to know your will within this." I was in a desert. The pulverizing effects of the desert, my marriage, had opened up a mysterious space in me to examine the actual level of my trust in God. And within the aridity of the waterlessness and the lack of consolations, I knew my trust in God could act as a wine press in me if I gave him all of me. When I understood that a massive self-amputation of my fears, emotions, questions, everything was needed, I began to regard Christ motioning me to his cross on Golgotha to earn inner peace, to earn the castle. I was to love Krista unconditionally and to crucify every fear of the unknown, no evidence of recovery, to the cross. Everything was to be given to God alone, and it would be part and parcel to my freedom, and that's how God would make this thing work, how Krista would be healed. A few more things I want to pass on, and I want to offer just as what really helped me. All of this led me to build, I guess, what I can call sort of a small cell in my soul. Teresa and John on the Cross had taught me meditative prayer. So each morning I began to waken at 5 a.m. and I lit a candle. And I took this dirt path through this hermitage in my soul. Mine looked like this cell in my soul. So I've been to Ireland many times, and I love thatched cottages. Mine was like a low beamed wood ceiling. There was a hearth fire over here, and there was 2 benches. And there was like a portrait, an old portrait of the Sacred Heart. There was always like a kettle of tea by the hearth fire. And I would just sit there, and all was kind of quiet and half light. Kind of sit there in the thatched cottage of my soul, the cell in my soul, and I would await Jesus to emerge. Wait for him to come and sit down on the bench across from me. And then Jesus often would come through the door. He'd come up that dirt path, come in the door, and he'd sit across from me. And there we spoke about everything, heart to heart, without ever saying a word. I would talk sometimes, but Jesus rarely spoke. Every now and then he would say a word or two. But it was this contemplative way, this meditative way that saved me. It calmed me. And it gave me the wisdom and the direction that I lacked. And I began to see that I couldn't step within this cell of mine until I completely stilled my mind and worked to separate all of my thoughts and from everything to desire total union with God. And as I became more self-aware, I set up mechanisms to detach from everything except from God. I was sort of like a little kid on a winter night who's got the blankets pulled up, just waiting for the fairy tale that mom or dad would read. And whenever my mind would sort of stray in that time to distraction, I had this habit of kind of taming it with this slowly repeated whisper. It was, Holy Spirit, rest on me. Holy Spirit, rest on me. And my little fear and my whatever it was, a little demon was trying to get in, I'd knock it aside. Holy Spirit, rest on me. I began to comprehend, really to know for the first time since the very beginning of this, that God was working, noiselessly moving through dark places in me to bring light. I imagined him then cutting away wrong patterns of my thinking with a small carving knife. As I gave way to him, I spoke in the small words of a child and gently asked him to replace the pain of my soul with his love and graces. I repeatedly handed over Krista and me to him as wounded lambs who have survived the fangs of a wolf. And I told him that we'd lost the path. And then we were alone. And I thanked him for finding us and setting us right, even though he really hadn't found us yet. But even as I thanked him, it seemed incongruous, right? Because we were still in the chocolate mess. Despite myself and despite my suspicions, I did believe that he had mysteriously placed Krista on his back. And you know what? He had me on his back too. And that was a warm image. That was quite a humbling image. Krista was a rag doll on one shoulder, and I was a rag doll on the other. And Jesus had us both. And I was no longer bringing the swallowing sea of my emotions into prayer. I was just meeting Christ in my inner cell, and I found myself throughout the day, the workday, every now and then going back in silence to that cell, and that was always very helpful to me. If there was a bad night, if Krista had a bad night, I calmly whispered to him about, how it hurt me, and was candid about feeling alone. I knew Jesus as he befriended the outcast and the poor and the pain. I knew his eyes were riveted to me in the poverty of my aloneness. I just knew I needed to remain obedient to God and love Krista without conditions. And as Christ looked upon me and loved me as a frail vessel, I was to do the same exact thing for Krista, who I knew noiselessly screamed for my love beneath her invisible sea of pain. I simplified my life around one simple idea, a single thought. Everything was a choice between two certain outcomes. Crucified love, devoid of sensible consolations, would bring peace to a haunted time. Succumbing to my emotions would be prompts for the evil one to send down choruses of demons to destroy us both. I knew my job was to get Krista to heaven. So I just kept nailing myself to the cross. I don't know, God, but you're going to do it. The desert, I found out, when Abraham found out, Ezekiel, Elijah, Jeremiah, Moses. The desert was not a desert to get sand whipped, to be famished, to starve, to be lonely and isolated, to seek water. The desert wasn't that. The Old Testament prophets and the wanderers, they understood the desert was a palace. That's what I understood for the first time in my life. Why was the desert a palace? Because I had nothing else. The deserts knew with their walking, the prophets knew with their walking stick, the further they traveled into the desert, well, God had called them there, right? So the further they went in there, the more they can encounter God alone. No cell phones, no earbuds, no YouTube, no videos, nothing. Not a book, not a Bible, not an interior castle, God alone. So my desert was a palace. What did God tell Jeremiah? Call to me, and I will answer you. And I'll tell you great and hidden things, which you do not know. The teacher never hides himself from the one who's suffering. The teacher is the only hope in the world. Without falling into this contemplative prayer, this meditative prayer, I would have been a goner. I think Satan would have gotten me. I don't know, maybe not. He was on his way. I'm going to wrap up this. You'll notice I didn't say a word about Father Flume, because I want you to buy my book. Remember, Krista asked me to write the book about Father Flume, about Father Sharbel and Father Flume. Krista and I, there's not a day that doesn't go by where we don't miss him for what he did for us, obviously. But I want to tell you God's sense of humor. God's remarkable sense of humor. You know, sometimes we throw that out there and we're like, oh yeah, God's got a great sense of humor, but no, God has a sense of humor. Months after Krista slammed the door on the holiest priest she's ever met, the one that she weeps over still, the one that she prays for still, the one that she thinks about all the time for what he had done for her. Months after, she came up to me and said the strangest thing one day. She said, Kevin, I want to go on retreat. And I'm like, what? You want to go on retreat? Yeah, I want to go on retreat. Do they have a silent retreat for women too? I know you've been going on that men's silent retreat. I said, yeah, they do. Well, when is it? I said, well, it's this month. And yeah, I'm going to go. I'd like to go. And so Krista went very with trepidation, with fear. She had never been on a retreat. But God was at work. You can imagine my joy and my hope and all that stuff that a husband feels about a wife who's been long trapped in a mother wound. So Krista took off on a Friday afternoon, and about 5 hours later, she sent me a text at 9:30 at night. And she said, hey, the last talk ended. They're having confessions now. I'm going to go to confession. There's 2 lines. One priest is Father Matt Fish, and it looks like the other is a priest named Father Martin Flume. I don't know them. Who should I go to? Krista said my text came back in all caps. Go to Father Flume. Go face to face. Krista stepped into the confessional. And this is the part where the writer, where the speaker, where the husband cries, but I'm going to hold it in because this was the day, this was the moment where Jesus Christ said, yep, this is your guy, Father Flume. And for the first time, Krista confessed the drinking. And this was the day that Krista began to heal. And this was the day that Father Flume said, I will never leave you. until we get this stinking, rotten demon out of you. These lions, these tigers, these bears that were never addressed years and years ago, they got to go. And that began the relationship between Krista and Father Flume. That one day, during the year of 2020, when a sacramental moratorium worldwide was put on the church temporarily, everything shut down, and Krista was crescendoing, healing. Father Flume said, the greatest thing that you can do, Krista, to heal is to spend time in front of the Eucharistic face of Jesus. So Krista was attending daily Mass, 1 or 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours of adoration, daily rosary, intensive spiritual direction, weekly confessions. She was there, still having some falls, but there. Her eyes were back. Her humility, her essence was back. Her nature was back. And then the letter comes across, shut them down. Shut the churches down, DC. Father Flume knew there was people like my wife. That's when he began to intensify his priesthood. And it was that year, later on that year, that Krista came home one day and said, I want to tell you what happened last night. And that was the night that the miracle came into Krista's life, and the monster left. And now we're 4 years later on our honeymoon, still. I don't know, after this talk, she might not like me anymore. How'd it go, Chris? Chris, how'd it go? Come on up here. Come on up here.
I can see her from here.
Can you see her over there? You asked for it, sweetie. But what I said earlier is true. That's the old Adam. That's the old Eve. That's nothing. That's the old skin. That doesn't matter. Krista said, expose me so Father Flume can be exposed. But again, maybe I'm more of a supernaturalist than I think. But this book's about marriage. I think it's about Father Flume. Krista thinks it's about Father Flume. And it certainly is. But this is about marriage and prayer. So with that said, I'm going to shut it down. And Anne, thank you very much. This is wonderful to be with you.